Welcome back to the CB&Q in Wyoming. I'm Mark Pruitt. This is part 3 of our 3-part look at the track plan. In part 1, we looked at the off-map Northern Pacific line through Laurel, Montana, and the Franny Cutoff, which runs from Laurel to Franny, Wyoming. Recall that the Franny Cutoff also represents the CB&Q from Scottsbluff, Nebraska to Orange Junction, Wyoming, and the Chicago and Northwestern from Crawford, Nebraska to Orange Junction. In part 2, we looked at the Casper sub itself from Orange Junction to Franny. This represents the main line through central Wyoming and is the focus of the bulk of the modeled line. In this final piece, part 3, we look at the modeled branches off the main line. There are 2, the CB&Q branch from Franny to Cody, and the Chicago and Northwestern connection from Showbon, where the CNW trackage rights over the Burlington ended, to Lander. Let's start with the Cody branch, which originates in Franny in the upper right corner. First, let's get rid of all the unnecessary clutter and combine the upper level with part of the lower level plan so that we can follow it more easily. Here we see our train that's headed to Cody in the Oren/Franny interchange yard on the lower level. It departs the yard and heads onto the Cody branch. The first location we come to is Powell. Powell's economy is based almost entirely on agriculture. It ships sugar beets and other produce to the appropriate markets, and the various businesses in town all exist in one form or another to service that industry. This is a shot of Powell from the 1990s. There's one double-ended spur on the railroad, serving several silos and similar businesses along its length. Departing Powell westward to Cody, we come to a spot where the railroad crossed Alkali Creek. This is one of my favorite spots on the entire layout. My father was a Wyoming highway patrolman in the early 1960s, and I used to ride along with him on occasion. I was around 8 years old when we passed over the creek and under the Burlington line on the old highway bridge. As of a few years ago, both bridges were still there, but as you can see, the highway was rerouted across the tracks at grade nearby sometime in the late 20th century. Once past Alkali Creek, it's only a short trip into Cody itself. This is the end of the Cody branch. Here we find a Y for turning locomotives, a few tiny local industries, and the major source of revenue along this branch, the Husky Refinery, which primarily produced asphalt. A small yard mainly for storing tank cars for the refinery between trains can also be found here. This is the Husky Refinery as it existed in the mid-1990s, several years after it was shut down. As a young child in the 1960s, I remember gazing at night out the front window of our house at the crest of a hill over Beck Lake, looking at the blazing lights of the refinery a couple miles away. The refinery was razed in the early 2000s and is now just an empty field. Nearby is a gypsum board plant that commenced operation some years after the refinery was closed. Cody was also the Burlington's gateway to Yellowstone National Park. The Burlington Inn, seen in this very old postcard, along with the much more famous Irma Hotel and other such places, provided lodging for visitors awaiting their 50-mile ride from the end of the line in Cody to Yellowstone National Park. To this day, Cody remains a major gateway to Yellowstone, and even more than in the past, is a destination for tourists wanting to experience the Wild West. Now we'll take a look at the second branch on the layout, the Chicago and Northwestern line from Showbon to Lander. On the layout, the CNW branch begins at Showbon, lower center in this diagram. Showbon is simply the name for the turnout where the CNW diverges from the Burlington trackage. From Casper to Showbon, the CNW had running rights over the Burlington's track. As we approach the Wind River Canyon, the CNW branch dives behind the mountains and becomes a hidden branch all the way to Lander, with just a few short areas daylighted. The first of these daylighted areas is in the turnaround blob at the end of the Thermopolis-Worland Peninsula. In reality, the CNW line to Lander proceeds from Showbone west to Riverton and then southwest to Lander, while the Burlington line runs roughly north from Showbone to Thermopolis. Hidden once again, the line continues on towards Lander on the layout. The second short daylighted section is in a depression between Worland and Grable. From this point on, the CNW line continues on hidden track behind Grable, then underneath the Oren-Franny interchange yard, until it finally reappears below level where it runs on into Lander. This is a view of Lander from US 287 from the east, circa 1940. The grain elevator to the left is a local landmark and is still standing to this day. This is roughly the same view in 1970. Same grain elevator but repainted. Most of the other buildings are the same as well, but the signage is completely different, as are most of the other details. Here is the Lander Depot from many years ago. A small part of it still remains as the home of the Chamber of Commerce. Lander was the end of the cowboy line of the Chicago Northwestern. After 66 years of service, the railroad abandoned Lander in 1972. The trains still run west out of Casper to Riverton, about 25 miles northeast of Lander, until sometime in the mid-1980s, when pretty much everything west of Casper was either sold or abandoned. The 23 miles from Shoshone, Wyoming to Riverton is now a rail trail. In this view from the 1990s, we're looking down the trail east from Riverton towards Shoshone. Everything west of Orange Junction, even Casper, was abandoned right after the Union Pacific acquired the CNW in 1995. Most of the grade is still visible, if you know where to look, and many of the bridges, culverts, and whatnot are still there, but the rails are gone. And so ends our all too detailed look at the track plan for the CB&Q in Wyoming. I'm not quite finished though, because in all of the last 3 videos, I've only provided the tiniest of hints in how everything will play together to make a functioning model railroad. The CB&Q in Wyoming was designed not only to allow for casual running of trains, but even more for prototypical operations. Coming in 2019 will be a video or 2 that explore the operating concept of the layout. We'll learn how the Northern Pacific, Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy, and Chicago Northwestern all play together in their various main lines, branches, and junctions to provide realistic train movements that hopefully will equate to many hours of fun for an operating crew. See you there!